All right, guys, welcome back. I think we are on episode 28 of the Speed Up and Get Your Hits podcast. With me, as always, I've got Nick from Velox Trainer Group and Brennan from Gateway Defense, I believe for SpecTrain. And we're just three shooters and firearms instructors that like to talk about shooting and training and how to get more better. And we hope these conversations are educational for folks. Primarily, that's kind of the whole idea behind this. And so, with that said, fellas, as always, I'd love to start off and just hear a little bit what you guys been working on in your personal training, what you're doing, what you're trying to get better at these days.
I've been doing a bunch of rifle stuff lately,
Mm-hmm.
specifically with like different types of guns. Just trying to figure out, different types of, recoil impulses and stuff like that, and what techniques and what things are, going to be the same across the board, despite what gun that you have. And I think it's kind of opened my eyes to a couple little tiny key things in what I do with the mount. So yeah,
Do
that's
tell.
pretty much it. What's up?
You're just gonna leave us hanging? They're not gonna like give us the pearls? What the
Yeah,
heck,
I think.
bro?
Yeah, so over the last probably 5 to 6 months, I've been doing this, and
Okay.
doing this with scars, MCX, different length, different barrel lengths, mostly with like three prong, hard words to say, 3-prong flash hiders or A2 flash hiders. So like
I hate those
duty
so
style guns
much.
that aren't doing you any sort of favors in terms of
Yeah.
keeping the gun on target. Um, and I think a lot of the things that I thought used to work, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think work across the board. One particular thing is my shoulder. I used to roll this shoulder all the way forward. I find
Mm-hmm.
that when it's like a duty style gun, when there's no comp, no nothing on it like that, I find that almost creates like a hinge point for the gun to like raise up on. So like stick a 3-pronged flash hider on it, roll the shoulder really forward into the buttstock, and it like creates a hinge for the rifle to go up and down on. Another thing that I've found with it is
So
it's hard to
if we
keep.
can, I'm actually
Yeah.
super curious on that point. So like, what are you doing differently to deal with that?
So instead of rolling the shoulder all the way forward, I don't keep it all
Mm-hmm.
the way back. It's just kind of somewhere in between. And it's
Mm.
almost like it allows the rifle to move back just a little bit, but it
Mm-hmm.
it turns to zero a lot more predictably. Um, and like I put stuff on, like videoed myself doing this, and you could see it in the video too. Like the gun, I'm no longer having to put a bunch of effort into making the gun track efficiently or track predictably. Like the gun just kind of does this, like it goes straight back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
instead of like if you roll the shoulder all the way forward and try to hard stop it, it hinges. And another thing about, at least what I've found with trying to hard stop it, it's hard to keep that whole firing side quiet on the gun while you're shooting it, and then you see like left trends on the target. At least for a righty, it
Mm.
would be for a lefty. So I don't know. I think it'd be interesting if you guys tried
Interesting.
it out. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about it, because I know you guys are not emotionally locked into techniques.
Well, so it's interesting
For
that you
sure.
say that because so I got sent my first three prongs like I don't know maybe a few weeks ago now. Literally, I've never shot those before.
Yep.
I personally see them as kind of pointless in terms of I would never like actually buy one, but um, like it's an interesting muzzle device for training purposes for sure. I always knew obviously that A2s are partially a compensator,
It is.
for sure,
Yep.
but I was probably underestimating the amount that they actually do that. The main thing for me that I found is I feel like with the same mount on the A2 versus a 3-prong, I can basically make the gun behave the exact same way. I just have to actually lean into the gun a little bit more with the 3-prong because it's sort of changing the angle of the support. Obviously, when you're standing like super straight up and down, like the main thing the gun's hitting when your shoulders rolled forward is like that clavicle bone,
Yep.
which is like further forward. Like there may be some support above that in the shoulder, but it's further to the rear. Versus if you actually lean into it more, it kind of brings more support at the top of the buttstock. So that was the interesting thing that I found with the 3-prong. I felt like I could make the gun behave roughly the same, but I definitely had to sort of at the hips lean into the gun more,
So
which
I have a
specifically is
question.
a bummer on the move. But that's what I've been experimenting
That's
with.
exactly. So I was about to ask that. So like leaning into it, how do you feel about shooting on the move, and how consistent is that? Like, say, shooting a bill drill at 50. Like, do you find you can keep that same exact lean the whole time, or do you find like you might let off a little bit and then push back into it and by a little bit, I mean like exactly that. Like, if you do just a little bit of that at 50, it's probably off the target.
Yeah, like if you're trying to shoot predictively, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I was shooting. I mean, I think I posted this. You guys may have seen this video, but I was forcing myself to hold sub quarter second splits, like
Yep.
just like throughout the entire exercise, like just running the gun pretty hard at that distance. Obviously, with like my guns, it's usually pretty easy to hold like all alphas doing that. I was not doing that with the 3-prongs for sure. There was definitely
Yeah.
I would say mostly alphas, but maybe 20% Charlies, something like that, and like 1 or 2 deltas per like 20 round string usually is what I'm doing currently.
Yeah.
Which is not quite as good. So yeah, more to figure out there for sure, but
Yeah. I'm curious to hear.
interesting to play with.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like the more you play with that, um,
Yeah,
I'd like to see if you're reaching the same type of conclusions that I've been.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I put a 3-prong on a new Hodge upper actually that I got put together for me, and yeah, same kind of thing. Like exactly what you were saying, Nick, is like I'm big like roll your shoulder forward like all the way. Like I also shrug it up, and it's always worked like pretty well for me. But with the like no suppressor, no brake on there or anything, like I was definitely the dot was just lifting way higher, like you were talking about. Like it's almost like you're saying like the hinge like just getting way more dot lift than normal. And so I was playing around with how to fix that. I was actually doing the same thing Billy was just talking about, like leaning into the gun a little bit more, putting a little bit more of like body input into it, because like I don't think like pulling on the gun with your support hand is ever like really a good idea.
Yeah.
But that was like the very first thing I was tempted to do. Like as I was watching my dot, I was like, okay, like I got to do something different here. So I'll play around with that with a shoulder thing, because that never even crossed my mind. So that's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Another thing that I've kind of, and this is weird. Like I think a lot of people will figure this like type of thing out. Like the longer you shoot, the more you like nerd out on stuff. Like things will be told to you 10 years ago, and then you'll remember it in 10 years and be like, oh, that's what they were talking. So like uh, at least 10 years ago, I took a Frank Proctor class, right? And he was talking about, grab the middle of the rail and just let your elbow hang. It'll be easy effort, right? And that's, I believe, I hope, if Frank ever hears this, like, I hope I delivered that like he, said it. Um,
It sounds like
but
something he would say.
at the time, I was like,
It does.
all right, like, I guess it sounds good, but like, like shooting doubles and stuff with these type of rifles that I've been shooting, it's like, oh, like super easy effort, meaning like you can hold that the entire time instead of doing things like, hey, pull 100% with the support hand, or roll this shoulder and like pull with your firing hand into your shoulder. I think, at least what I have found is doing that stuff creates different pressures on the gun throughout the whole string of fire, and it makes it really difficult to do. Like that whole like just grab the middle of the rail and just like let that oboe hang. You'll feel the rifle pull into your shoulder without having to use a bunch of muscle to do it. So
Hmm.
pretty neat stuff that I heard 10 years ago, and I guess finally clicked.
Yeah,
That's
I
cool.
think it's interesting. I think we all agree that you need to obviously pull the rifle back into your shoulder, but it's sort of like there's in several places in shooting there are places where you like some tension is required, but like
Yes.
you're trying to figure out how to have the required tension without like locking up all the things. Right, so
Mhm.
like shoulder tension is a perfect example. I think students get really confused in this sometimes because like the only thing that keeps the pistol up in front of your face is shoulder tension. Like you're holding the gun up with your shoulders, like at a certain point, right? That's what like keeps your arms up. But obviously, we're not trying to like lock everything up, right? That's obviously detrimental. But the same thing goes with like pulling that arm back. That's kind of what I found over the years. Like it's like, man, when you do the whole like, you know, lifting that elbow up and like locking everything up in kind of one unit, that's where, man, you start shooting on the move. You start trying to do, you know, quick transitions. You start trying to work in and around stuff. Like everything is just locked up, and you lose a lot of that mobility and kind of agility, and you get fatigued way faster, right? But like what you're saying, that's kind of more relaxed, like hand further to the rear, which is always the opposite of what I was taught. You know, not trying to stretch all the way out to the muzzle, but like a little bit further back, elbow more relaxed and down. It's just seems like a lot better way.
Well, and to me, it like goes to like pretty much what we do with the pistol, right? Like you hold the pistol in your hands, and whatever it does in recoil, like you're just allowing the gun to do whatever it's going to do, and you're not trying to fight it. All you're trying to do is get it to come back down to a very predictable spot. Now, I'm not saying like I don't care how high it lifts. Sure, like we all care about that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's certainly not something that I'm focusing on. And like, I think the way I've kind of figured out how to hold these rifles is very similar. Like it's just allowing the gun to return with minimal effort.
Yeah. Very good. Good stuff.
So,
yeah, so I was actually doing a bunch of rifle stuff, and then I went to the Eric Rafael class for my second year, and then I dropped all my rifles immediately and went back to pistols. But it's kind of cold up here, so rifles are a little bit easier to shoot these days. But with pistol stuff, so Eric class was great, as was expected. Very different class than last year.
Really?
So Billy, yeah, if you remember, like the two different classes, I think we were the first class and there was a class after us. I was under the impression, and I think correctly, that those two classes were pretty different. He talked about some pretty different stuff, like some bigger blocks. I think he did a bunch of swingers with us. I think he did like shooting on the move with them. So he did the same thing again this year. He catered both classes this year to whatever the students wanted. So pretty much everybody except Justin Anderson and Sean Griffith were returning students. So almost everybody else had taken his class before. So we pretty much just said, hey, we want to just shoot stages and get you to give us feedback on stages. And then if you pick out anything that you think would be beneficial for the group to work on kind of more isolated, let's do that as well. So half days pretty much worked on stages for the morning, shot like 6 stages. And then he did transitions the first day in the afternoon, and then another stage or two. And the second day was just like that, except we did shooting on the move. Biggest thing was like we were doing some absolutely insanely technically challenging and mentally challenging stages. He kind of broke it down. He was saying like 50% of your shooting game is mental preparation and execution of your stage plan, right? 25% is skill, 25% is mental, and then 50% is planning and execution. So the planning and execution, like I was definitely feeling that. We were doing back-to-back 48-round stages where you'd shoot it one way and then turn around, like reload your mags and shoot it back another way. So you pretty much had to have 2 stage plans ready to go. There was no time to like think or walk through stuff. And pretty insane stuff. Like, hey, every target has to be shot on the move, regardless of, the target. So pretty challenging stuff. The biggest thing I took away from that is like my training is way too easy. Like I don't do enough hard stuff. Even if I'm doing things that I'm not good at, I'm still making it too easy for me, if that makes sense, right? So it's like, oh, well, partials beyond 15 yards are difficult. So generally I would just set up partials at 15, 20, 25 yards and shoot them, right? Generally static. Maybe I'd add in a little bit of movement, entering a position, getting the gun up, and then, kind of attacking that partial. But he was just absolutely stacking the layers of difficulty much, much higher than that, to where everybody was a little bit stressed out. It was really challenging everybody in the class, including some pretty highly competitive, nationally competitive guys in the class. So I have been trying to incorporate that a bunch into my training, just making everything harder. I've been trying to make dry fire like as hard as possible, where I set up a really quick course of fire, don't give myself a ton of time to think about it or visualize everything perfectly, and just kind of go. And I think that's going to be helpful for me a lot with correcting mid stage as well. Big downfall for me is I will often like I'll have a little mental mistake and then I will like not recover well from that. Um, and he said the harder you make your training and the more you force yourself to think on your feet, like the easier that's going to become. So, yeah, just been trying to do a bunch of much more difficult training and trying to balance how much match mode stuff I'm practicing in versus how much development stuff I'm practicing in, because I'm certainly, nowhere near Eric's level.
Yeah.
And so there's still tons of stuff I do have to develop, but how do I develop it in a way where I'm not, kind of creating a crutch for myself? So
Yeah.
bunch to unpack there, but yeah, it's been really good. I actually feel like I have probably about 2 years worth of homework to do, which is great.
Awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome. For sure. I'm still working through stuff from that class last year for sure. And it's been interesting. It's funny. I was actually thinking about some of that stuff today. I consider myself very fortunate that pretty much whenever I want to on a Saturday, I can just go shoot with Chris Tilley, which is a rare resource to have. But man, watching that dude shoot stages even today, like one of the things that I notice is that obviously his stage execution is always very on point, and yet I do not see him putting nearly as much effort into stage planning as everybody else. Like the dude just seems to like walk up, kind of look at the stage, be like, yeah, I'm gonna go over here, and then like he has it, and it's just like
Yeah.
down. He's not doing like the Max Michelle 45 minutes of like visualization off the stage like thing, which is not. I'm not criticizing Max or anybody else. I'm just saying like it's clearly a skill to be able to master that stage plan like very very quickly, and seems to be a kind of a superpower, which is cool to have. So it's funny. I was thinking about that. Interesting to get your take, Brennan. I think a lot of people, there was like a sort of a viral trend across shooting social media last year after the Eric class. Like anybody who ever shoots a drill twice is just like wrong. Like we're only ever shooting things once. And I guess my kind of take after playing with that some obviously last year was like, yes, I need to do more of that, right? I need to do more stage planning, more execution mode training for sure, but also like that is not the only thing that I'm going to be doing in my training moving forward for sure. Like isolation is still really key. Like actually for those of us who are not Eric, like even though maybe in matches skills only 25, I'm not sure that that's quite where I would set the number, but like skill building is still important, and that requires actually isolating and working on things. What's kind of your take on that after going through the class again for a second time? How have you been kind of structuring your training in that regard?
Yeah, so I was definitely struggling with that idea afterwards as well, right? So like for the first few months after the class last year, it was like, okay, everything just has to be like a stage essentially. And then I
Mm-hmm.
realized that like stages just really aren't the best way or the most efficient way to practice like one thing, right?
Yeah.
My entries are not great right now, so just let's just shoot a stage. Like, well, no, like there's a ton of other things happening. But
Yeah.
what you can do, I think, is make drills more complicated to where,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, you can only shoot targets, or maybe you can only shoot a certain number of targets per position. So it's going to force you to do a lot of moving and a lot of entries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next time, instead of trying to game it and get away with kind of the exact same stuff or some stupid stuff, don't set it up the exact same way, but change up the order and do the exact same thing, but in a different order that does force you to think and plan again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think doing stuff like that is really good. For instance, we did a bunch of transition drills in class, and he was essentially doing not really designated target, but kind of like that, like a combination of designated target and like Simon Says, right? So he would be like, all right, so you had a plate. let's say you had 3 opens and 3 partials, okay, on, your 90 degrees of the range. And he'd go, all right, your order is plate, 2 opens, plate, reload, plate, 2 partials, plate, last 2 remaining targets, plate, right?
Right.
And we'd be like, okay. And, we'd repeat it real quick and like, is that right? He's like, yes, stand by. And we're like, oh, okay. And
Right.
so we're like pressured to go. And he's
Yeah.
like, I want you driving every transition as hard as you can, right? Like, get that gun there. Don't, because you're thinking through the order still, don't be like all timid and shy about it or whatever. And so we did, the same transition drill a bunch of different times, but he changed it up every time. So we had to think about it. And I would find myself getting a little bit lost in the sauce and like, which target is it? And just kind of hunting for the targets. And my transitions went down the drain. So just making that whole thing harder versus doing designated target the exact same way every time, or even just doing designated target for all of my transition drills, if that makes sense, because we kind of, at least I've done designated target enough that I can definitely get in a rhythm and just be like here, and you just kind of know exactly what to do without even really thinking about it beforehand, or really kind of planning what you want to do. So I think it just kind of ties into kind of what I said, is making everything harder than you think it should be, or than it kind of needs to be. And you can drill the same, or you can isolate the same skill over and over, but just don't fall into the habit of like draw, shoot, 2-2-2, reload, 2-2-2 over and over and over to practice your draws, transitions, and reloads, if that makes sense.
100%. Yep. And what I think for folks listening, just to keep in mind though, is like, I think there is, obviously as you progress in your skill set, like your training is going to change over time. Like the stuff you're talking about, I think, is stuff that I am transitioning more to, like more and more, like over time, hopefully the better that I get. Right.
Yes.
But like when you start, like obviously you're in a different spot. Like I'm sure you guys have all been in the place, as an example, like where you're like maybe in class working movement, for the first time with folks, and you see a guy come into a position and you're just watching his feet and you're like, dude, that entry was killer, man. Like you came in low, the gun was up early, like you shot at the earliest possible moment. It was stable, crushed it. And the dude's like, well, yeah, but I got a Charlie on the second target. And you're like, bro, I don't even care if you really hit the target right now. Like, to be honest with you, like you came into position correctly, and that's what we're working on. Right. So like, like there's obviously a time to ratchet it up for sure, but it's also like okay to isolate stuff and work on obviously, kind of basic skill building and isolation when you start off, but really good stuff. Man, we kind of got into some good stuff there that I wasn't expecting to. We got a lot of stuff we were planning on talking about tonight. We'll hopefully get to some of it, but
that's what happens when you take long breaks.
I know, right?
Lots happens.
I'll say quickly, obviously I've been working on some of the rifle stuff as well. One of my motivations for that is that my hand has been jacked. And what I wish that I had done is ignored so much of the advice that I got way sooner. And just started like working out really hard. Because that has been the ticket for me. And I bring this up because I know a lot of people have, shooter's elbow, tennis elbow, tendinopathy of some kind, especially in the support hands and stuff. I've been pretty lucky. I mean, I've been at this pretty heavy for like 10 years. And this is my first time really struggling with this. And obviously like rest is the number one thing that people recommended to me. Even like medical professionals and stuff are like, well, just try not to like shoot. And I'm bro, like, yes. I mean, I basically stopped dry firing for like months, but obviously that this is what we do. Like you guys know, we can't just like not touch a gun for 6 months. Like that's unfortunately just not really an option. And basically saw like no progress. And then I basically just started actually working out really heavy. This thing I posted on social media this week. This thing has been the lifesaver for me. I don't even really know what this is called. I got it. It's just called like a forearm roller. It has like a strap, right? You just kind of like turn your hands, for those of you that are watching the video stuff. It's nothing crazy. I got 10 pounds on here. But I mean, literally I started seeing results from that pretty much immediately. I started running that at the beginning of this week, and probably today's match is the first time that I shot with like for a day without, a distracting level of hand pain for the first time in like 6 months. So for what it's worth, maybe check out something like that if you're having problems that are similar to what I was having.
I think the majority of the time the answer is like build muscle around the thing that hurts.
Yeah.
And that thing probably not going to hurt anymore. Or at least in the future, it might not get injured again.
Right. Because like the advice that I got was like, man, if you work that thing, it's gonna get like you're gonna irritate it worse. And it's like, man, that's exactly the opposite. I needed to like actually work it more than I was to begin with, and make it hurt more like for a second, and then it like immediately gets better, which is cool. So anyway, the main topics we were trying to get into tonight, we got a few things that are pretty interesting. Starting with one that I know we've mentioned on the podcast quite a bit, but we're going to dive into it. And hopefully, again, this is for my audio listeners. You may want to circle back and check out the video for this portion because I think it'll be kind of interesting. But target diagnostics is obviously something that we have not only talked about them on the podcast, but we probably, if you've ever taken a class, has been hopefully a thing, but mostly has been taught, I think, wrong. For most of the history of classes that most of us have been exposed to.
The charts?
I'm sure everyone is
You're saying those charts are
picturing
wrong?
the wheel right now.
Come
Dude,
on.
I took a picture. I mean, I show up to my local indoor match last week, and the range has now like posted those up in the range again. Still, I'm like, still, bro? Like, come on. So anyway, what I did is I encountered what I found to be a fascinating example on social media of a target to look at this week on a lot of different levels. Now, what I'm actually hoping is that no one watching this recognizes where this is from. If you do, like, this is not shade at anybody in any way, shape, or form. It's just really, I was mentioning the guys earlier, it's like really hard for me to artificially create problems on target that actually look like the real thing. Like, I try to do demos sometimes of like, here's the wrong way to do it. And it's always just like more clean than it should be, and it's less random. And so this was a really good example that I thought I'm going to try to actually bring this up on screen. Hopefully this actually works. And we can have a look at it. Can you guys actually see what we're looking at here with this target?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So this will be an interesting exercise. I expect that we might all have kind of a little bit of a different perspective on some of the things that we see here, or at least I might. But as a couple baseline ideas, number one, this was a string of build drills, I think, at like 20 yards, right? And we see a time displayed here, which is not a shabby time for a 20-yard build drill. It's not anything record breaking, but it's respectable. And it's
the time. Can't see it.
3:47.
3, yeah.
Okay.
And it's almost all alphas, and there is 2 Charlies out of, what looks to be like a handful of strings. So again, I think what a lot of folks will do is be like, okay, cool. Like most of those strings were all alphas and were a good time. Great. And like kind of walk away from that. Right. And then, or like at best, like, hey, I've got a Charlie to the right. I've got a Charlie to the left. Maybe I'll try to think about where that Charlie came from. And I'll maybe like just try to think about that one thing as what I'm thinking about. And I think that none of us would probably look at this target exactly that way. As a matter of fact, for me, like when I look at this target, a lot of times what I see are kind of some, there's very commonly you'll see some flyers, like 1 or 2 that are like not a part of the group, right? Like for me, when I look at this one, like there's one down here. I think you can see my mouse down here, like at the bottom right. Like obviously, like the shooter probably screwed up on that shot, and he probably saw that happen. And like that's not something we really need to focus on. Like I would like ignore that and not even really think about that round because it's not really a part of the trend. Same thing, honestly, probably for this one, like up at the very top. I would probably for the most part just like kill those and ignore those. And mostly what I would look for on the target is like, hey, are there trends? I think for me, the baseline of target diagnostics is the idea that if I'm aiming in the center, the faster that I go and the farther that I get away from that target, most likely, the more the group is going to expand. But hopefully it should expand concentrically around your point of aim. That's kind of where like bullseye targets obviously came from, right? Like your round is probably going to expand in a concentric fashion. And if it's not doing exactly that, and if there's any kind of trends that are not that, they can be really indicative of things in the process that you're doing incorrectly. So fellas, as we look at this target, like what do you guys see? Because again, I think we may have some different ideas, which will kind of indicate that this is obviously there's some science to it, but it's also partially art as well. And there's some subjectivity to it. So I'm curious to see, like, here, first of all, what do
Is,
you guys kind of see on this target?
is this a right-handed shooter?
Yes.
Yeah.
Picked up on that, huh?
Well, I just wanted to check because it'd probably be a little bit different if it was a left-handed shooter.
Yeah. What would you say if this was a left-handed shooter, bro? I'm curious.
I mean, I would probably be like, you should talk to
What?
somebody smarter than me because I don't.
Yeah. What was you doing? Is the question.
I mean,
Yeah,
the real
no,
thing is
right-handed
like,
shooter.
don't be left-handed, right? I mean, that's the
Also-
easiest answer.
True.
Yeah. So I would say the gun is more or less fishtailing in that guy's hand. Like, it is not consistent pressures throughout the string of fire, and the gun is
Mhm.
doing the whole twisty turny thing, which is why it is basically, I think Ben calls it a seatbelt, right? Like a seatbelt style group, but it's within the alpha. And I think a lot of people, like you say, might go, well, hell, it's all inside the alpha. It's not a big deal. But like, it actually is a big deal because it tells you what your grip is doing. And if you want to get better, these are the things that you need to pay attention to. So probably the grip is moving around inside of his hand. And I don't know what you guys think, but I tend to think that a lot of this comes from watching the dot bounce up and down, because when you watch the dot bounce up and down, you no longer have a point of reference to return the gun to on the target. And then you'll see people, like, obviously it's going to go high, right? If you're going to watch the dot, like, that's where the bullets are going to go. When the gun lifts, one's going to go high. And then since you no longer have a point of reference on the target to return the gun to, it ends up going past it, which is why you see it like a diagonal, like seatbelt style group.
I would agree with that for the most part. I think oftentimes, so for sure agree about like looking at the dot. For me, looking at the dot though does not necessarily have everything to do with like high right shots per se. For me, generally, what I see and what I've noticed in myself in the past is if I start squeezing the gun with my whole hand and my bottom three fingers, specifically the fingertips, start getting involved in the grip, as you guys know, like that tends to kind of torque the gun down into your weak side, right? So for me, right-handed, it goes down into the left. And once that happens, and I see that my dot returned low and left, well, not really returned, but it came back to the spot, and then I torqued into it and I watched it go that way. That's when I get distracted and start looking at the dot, and then I get that trend low left to high right. For me, I almost never see that happen where it's all good, like nice and centered, the return is good, and then I just really got distracted by my dot and just looked up and just watched it somehow go high right. So for me, it's usually preceded by torquing into the gun improperly. But Nick, like you were saying, improper grip pressures, specifically incorrect, inconsistent grip pressures, that it causes that type of pattern for me generally.
Yeah. And look, a lot of times we can have more than one thing happening at the same time also.
Yeah.
But
100%.
I think for me, like if I see vertical stringing specifically that's like high only and not low, like I'm very suspicious that that's dot watching 100%, right? Because obviously when the dot leaves the target, it's going up. And if your eyes follow that thing up, like where's the dot going to come back to? Where you're looking, right? And so that definitely creates high vertical stringing for sure. When I see that high right to low left, I'm very suspicious, like you were saying, Brennan, that's got a lot to do with that firing hand grip pressures that are changing, that is causing that gun to start streaking, like as you're going through a string, especially if this is on a bill drill, right, and not on doubles, where you're just the gun is never stopping through the string. If it's going like that, to me, that tends to be a lot of that grip pressure that's obviously changing. We obviously see this, when someone is doing slow fire and it's going low left, we typically don't get the high right element of it. We just see like maybe some in the middle and then a bunch of them diving low left that come from that, changing grip pressures in the firing hand. But then when we extend that issue, like you said, throughout a string, is that compensation where the whole gun is just streaking high right to low left. as a result of those grip pressures. And so, again, maybe the results that we set or the parameters we set for the exercise, if we had a goal oriented mindset for this drill, like we met the goal, but man, there's definite issues that are happening here for the shooter on this string that are going to show up. As an example, if we backed up 5 yards, right, to 25 yards and tried to do the same thing, like all of a sudden we're not shooting all alphas anymore, for sure. Right? Like that quick, it's gonna show like big changes in the results. It's interesting to me, and I'm interested. You guys tell me if I'm totally out to lunch here. When I first saw this target, I was fascinated by it because I'm like, man, to me, there's almost like two very distinct trends that are completely different happening at the same time. Like when I look at it, like we obviously have the classic seatbelt, the high right to low left. We almost have this whole other thing that's happening at the same time, which is a string of rounds that are like almost perfect elevation wise, but are stringing left to right. On the target. If we imagine that the high left and low right stuff is not there, is this something that you guys see as well, like in your classes and stuff? And what would, if you just saw that kind of more horizontal circle, what would you think was going on?
So I think you see that more with rifle than what you do pistol. And that's definitely from people like shoving the gun and then pushing it around with their support hand. But I think in terms of pistol shooting, I think like I said before, I think, more or less pushing the gun around like this in your hand. It's like the gun is twisting around in your hands instead of like just being mounted into your hands, more or less, if that makes sense.
And even just like you were, I mean, obviously what we're actually seeing, just to be clear before we talk about like the source of it, the gun is returning to a decent spot elevation wise for those rounds, but it's not returning precisely left and right. It's landing in a different spot on the target, left and right, as it's coming back, right? So what causes that? Obviously, the hands can definitely be a part of it. Man, I see that a lot. Even like you were just saying from rifle though, like man, if you're dealing with issues in elbow or shoulder tension that are changing throughout the string, man, that can cause like very distinctly, like your elevation is probably still going to be good, but if you are, driving the shoulders, as an example, driving the shoulders forward more, you'll see that like a lot during a string, or the same thing with the elbows. Man, that can cause absolute changes in like how the gun is returning, especially for me to look at this target and be like, man, it seems like there's like two very different things happening at the exact same time. And from one string to another, like we see different issues obviously show up, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. So I tend to see that type of group from a very specific style of shooting. Like Billy, I think you were just kind of almost hinting at it, right? But the guys who do like the tactical turtle and lock out their elbows and then it breaks their wrists a lot, for me, they don't get a very precise return left and right. Right. But the guys who are kind of like dropping their elbows and kind of putting more pressure into the sides of it versus just like torquing up and into the gun, maybe it's more down and dropping it into the grip. That's where I see people that have a much more consistent left and right return. For sure. I also see this from people, and it tends to be the same shooter. When you are really hyperextended like that, people's support hand tends to get like way out in front of the grip, right? To where you're kind of like up there on your takedown lever or something like that. Maybe you've got your thumb really involved where you're trying to shove on your fancy like gas pedal that you got cut into your gun or whatever, right? And people are like really trying to get into that thing like the way we used to shoot rifles with our arms super hyperextended. I think that causes uneven pressures because now we're putting, we've got pressure and we're trying to hold it on kind of like the hinge, which is the grip back here. And then we're putting all this pressure up forward. And I think that tends to twist the gun around, like Nick was saying, and is just not helpful. When I started pulling both of my hands back and really prioritizing the meaty part of my palms, clamping onto the back of the gun and using my fingers here like a hinge, and like that's like the door jamb, and it just shuts in the back like this. I got much more consistent up and down stringing instead of that inconsistent side to side. So generally that shooter's the same person. I think it comes with hyperextending the elbows. But yeah, I can almost kind of tie it to a style of shooting.
Well, it's funny because like usually when I see folks that are having troubles with the wrists breaking in recoil, that obviously gives you a very inconsistent return to zero. But you typically see like massive vertical stringing from that as well, where they're having troubles because they're yanking the gun back down and trying to stop it on a certain spot, and you see that. But once if they have figured that part out, right, and they've figured out a way to kind of get around that, I always talk about recoil control. Like, man, the gun's gonna move somewhere. And so ideally,
Yeah.
we're going to give it a preferable way out that'll result in a consistent path and a consistent return. But if you don't, right? If you don't give it a way out, and if you lock those elbows and if you lock those shoulders, sometimes you get it where it's like, man, the gun's just like hunting for somewhere to go, and it's like, man, one time it's going to go that way and the other time it's going to go that way. And it's just like fighting for a way to go. And like you said, that, man, you start seeing that left and right bounce. As that tension increases in the shoulders and the elbows. So, but the specifics aside, and again, I think the main idea for folks is just the idea of, man, be looking for trends. If I can give folks listening to this episode one thing to take away, look for trends on your target, regardless of how good the results are per whatever scoring system you are using. Be looking for trends on your target. And this, I think for some of us, this seems like a very simple idea, but man, I did a class 2 weeks ago for a whole slew of, law enforcement firearms instructors. And just that concept seemed to be like earth shattering, and folks are taking away like, man, is so cool. And it's going to change the way we look at training. And I'm like, cool. We need to bring this up and reemphasize it for folks because it's not getting around. It still hasn't gotten out to everybody. Right. And so, thought I'd bring that up. Any last thoughts on this target or anything we talking about?
Nick, didn't you make a video on YouTube pretty recently? Like, alphas aren't just alphas in training. Like,
You did.
You've got to evaluate it past that. I think this is like a perfect example because whatever drill this dude was shooting, like those are excellent results when you score it. you know?
Yeah.
And like you were saying, Nick, in that video, like in a match, that's a fantastic target. In training, there's definitely like homework to take away from that.
100%. I think like, hey man, you want to shoot alphas at a match? This is the way to do it. If your training strategy is like, I'm just going to quote unquote use the entire alpha, dude, I think you're wrong. Like, I think that is a wrong training strategy to use, right? Like, you have to look at training deeper than just using the entire alpha.
Yeah. Now, like, again, because when as soon as I hear you say that, I'm thinking about like particular people that I know that are very good shooters and instructors that are going to have objections.
Good.
There's a time and a place for different kinds of training for sure. As an example, right? Like, the build drill competition for me last year was very interesting, because I'm not particularly interested in like what we literally kind of ended up doing for that was like figuring out like, okay, are there techniques we can adopt that allow us to do something cool like 1 in every 6 attempts? Right? Which is not something I'm particularly interested in, actually, right? Like, that's not like the goal of our training mostly. But like pushing for stuff like that, like, is there stuff that I learned along the way that made me a better shooter in general? Like, I would say yes. Like, there was stuff that I learned from that exercise. So, like, again, sometimes you are going to have like results based training where you're like, hey, I'm gonna if my parameters are I want to put 6 rounds in that A zone as fast as possible, like, what can I do to get away with it? As an example, like, can I fire that first shot like well before I get any kind of confirmation, and it's just know that it's probably going to be in that A zone at 7 yards somewhere, right? And not be too sad about that, right? Like, using the A zone in that sense, like, yes, there's a time and a place for it, but that's very different from seeing a trend on target that is a result of something you weren't doing intentionally.
Sure.
Right?
But I think you can take those parameters of like, hey, I'm going to allow myself, like, I don't really care too much about accuracy in the name of trying to inoculate myself to speed. I think that's a super important thing. But I think at the end of the day, you could still look at the target and be like, yep, that's what I did right there. right?
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like I'm
Yeah,
not saying
100%.
like, everything needs to be like super tight alphas.
Right.
Um,
And
I
that's the piece that I think gets lost in translation, right?
Yeah.
We're not like, again, if I was looking at this dude's shooting at this distance with the drill he was doing in his times, and like the group was filling the A zone side to side, right? And even with some Charlies, but it was a concentric group around the point of aim, I wouldn't be saying, oh, your group needs to be tighter, dude.
No.
That wouldn't be the takeaway, right? We're not, the point here is not group size. It's not accuracy standard. It's not any of that. It's, man, are we seeing trends on target that are resulting from something you weren't doing on purpose? And that's what we're trying to identify.
Yeah.
Here's a super cool trend that I saw today. I actually took a picture of it. We were shooting a tuxedo, and we were doing designated target, and I had a tux all the way off to the left. And I wanted people, it was like kind of a big swing, and that, like, I put that target there for a reason, right? And the interesting thing about that particular target was I saw bullets on the left side of the alpha and the right side of the alpha. There were barely any in the center. There were quite a few, like,
That's disappointing.
it was going right to left, right? And there were
Yeah.
quite a few, like, noise hit on the left. But interesting thing, if you stuck a Noe on the left, you were probably going to stick a Noe on the right too, because you shove the gun so hard, and then like you shove the gun, and then you try to correct, and it overcorrects into the right side of the Noe. And so it was interesting to me to see that trend. It was like, okay, like that's pretty much a trend of like shoving the gun really hard to the target.
Yeah. Or, like, I'll tell you what
And
happens to me, right? Because I am not immune to that situation. I've gotten so good at it, I know when my round broke the perf or not on the left or right of that tux. You know what I'm
yep,
saying? You guys
yep,
ever do that on a classifier? You're
yep,
like, oh yeah, that one tagged the A zone, I'm pretty sure. Because what'll happen for me, right? Like, so obviously what you're trying to do, on a target or whatever, is stare a hole in the center, and maybe you'll see the dot, hanging out over here to the right side of the A zone, and you're like, yep, that's good enough, send it. But what happens, like, when you really care whether that dot is like right there or right there, you're like, is it? And you look at it. Right?
yep.
And so it, like, because you care about the actual positioning of the dot so much more with that, like, hard deadline, it gives you a visual distraction issue. Anyway, yeah, good stuff. Let
Yeah.
me get this.
Real quick
Yeah,
thing
go ahead.
on the sometimes it's okay to be results or like outcome based, right? Like looking
Yep.
for a specific outcome. I think we have been told for a really long time that that's just essentially the worst possible thing you can do for your training. And I think most people who would say that, if you really had a conversation with them, they would admit there are a bunch of exceptions to that, right? Like,
Yes.
like, are you trying to get more? Are you trying to be faster? Are you trying to be more accurate? Like at a very base level, there's that. But for instance, like, Eric's class, he talks a lot about, there's these rules and you have to fall within these rules. And so on this stage, this hit factor is a 7 hit factor stage. This requires 10% Charlies, and you should not shoot more than 10% Charlies on this stage. Right. And it kind of determines a little bit of the speed that you're going. It definitely determines how many alphas versus Charlies and the actual points that you're going to shoot. But you can still absolutely go shoot stages or drills, complicated stuff like that all day long, and also walk up to an open target and see, your alphas like this and go, okay, what the heck happened there? Right. For sure. So even if you are training, with some outcome based stuff or goals, you should always be diagnosing it.
Well, that I was getting ready to say. I not only think outcome-based training is okay, I think it's absolutely crucial, but you
Yeah.
have to, again, have an idea of what you're training for. So, like, this is the difference in my mind between the exploration mode versus the execution mode training. Like, when you're
Yes.
doing match mode training, just trying to basically set a goal of shooting what you can do 10 times in a row without screwing up and getting consistent results, that is outcome-based training. And that's okay. You're not
Yeah.
trying to do skill development there, right? You're
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to shoot within your limits there. And so that
Yeah.
is outcome-based training. But again,
So is shooting a match.
so is shooting a match. That's outcome-based, an outcome-based exercise.
Mhm.
what I always encourage folks is like, man, just regardless of which mode you're in or what you're like, have a very specific idea of what you're trying to accomplish in training, and then figure out a way to actually work on that and do it. That's versus just like, hey, I saw this drill on Instagram, I'm gonna go shoot that a bunch of times today. Like, no, like have a specific idea of like, what am I trying to get out of this? What am I trying to work on? Like, how am I scoring this? Right? Is it process? Is it whatever it is? And like, what am I actually analyzing? And what looks like a good run? What looks like a bad run? Have those ideas ahead of time. Last shot on.
Okay,
that was good.
I'm gonna say it really quick, just because I think this is kind of interesting. So, like we all agree, shooting a match that is outcome based performance, right? Like we are looking for a specific outcome.
Sure.
Obviously, there's things you can do that you have to stay consistent with for the process for that to happen. Generally, what would be the big difference then? Because like I would say a bad example of that would be, like Billy, I'll pick on you, right? Like taking the Billy drill standards and shooting that over and over and over and over and over and over and over until you can set, the record on it, right? Versus potentially doing a bunch of other. It was
fine until that last bit.
Until potentially training those skills another way, or anybody's standards, right? Doing it over and over, like that tends to be the bad side of, or the potentially the detrimental side of outcome-based training, where we're just trying to pass somebody's cold start or standards or classifier or whatever it is. What's the difference there between, pushing for an outcome and shooting it for, within a rule set and really trying to accomplish something at a match versus doing somebody's, standards or internet drill?
Well, a match is not a standardized drill. The Billy drill is like, hey, this is a known thing. A match, nothing is known.
Exactly.
I think it's very different.
Yeah. So what I was gonna say, since you brought up, like, obviously the Billy drill thing is essentially it is a standardized drill in the sense that it's build drills at different distances, and that is an assessment that we shoot at the end of exploring confirmation levels on targets of varying difficulty. Right?
Certainly.
So when you're doing that, right, in your training in exploration mode, and you're pushing for outside of your comfort level, seeing what you can get away with in terms of minimizing your level of confirmation and how aggressively you can pull the trigger and so forth. At a certain point, do you need to go like shoot a bunch of doubles at like set distances or with targets of varying difficulty and figure out like, okay, what can I actually do 10 times out of 10 without like really screwing up at this distance, so that you have an idea of what your actual skill set is? Like, yes, right? So is like going and shooting a bunch of build drills at 25, like not trying to get better, but just trying to actually figure out what you can do consistently and have good execution at 25, like an okay thing to do? Yes.
Yeah.
But if you're actually trying to get better at it, right? Like to your point, Brennan, like with that drill as an example, like what I tell folks all the time is like, okay, you shoot the Billy drill standards, you get a score. The way you get better and better at that drill should not be by shooting it over and over again. It should be, okay, like what is the low hanging fruit? What can I get better here? Did my time suck because my draw is awful? Right? Okay, cool. Well, shooting the Billy drill standards over and over again is probably not going to result in your draw getting like significantly better in a hurry.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? Go work on the draw for a while, right? And then come back and shoot it again and see if your score changed. Okay, cool. Now what's the low hanging fruit? Well, it's my accuracy at 25. Okay, cool. Maybe you need to go like start with some group shooting, like, or like whatever it is. Isolate the piece that you're struggling with, work on that thing. And then, yes, is having an assessment drill to like actually get a score and figure out like how things and like track progression over time a bad idea? I don't think so. I have a couple that I revisit every once in a while just to kind of see where things are at. But the idea is not to get good at shooting the drill; it's to actually do skill building.
Right.
So maybe I think Nick's raring to say something over there.
Yeah. Maybe do things like diagnose what the target is, diagnose the hits on the. I think that'd be a good idea.
Yes, totally. For sure. Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that is something that does get confused like quite a bit. And it's kind of an interesting spin because everybody's like process versus outcome, and outcome's okay sometimes, but it can definitely be spun the wrong way if we're not careful.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool.
That was some good meaty stuff. I think you guys had a couple fun side quests we were gonna hit really quick before we wrap up. Who wants to go first?
Well, we brought up the poaching material thing, and this could probably be like a whole hour-long topic, but I hope not.
Yeah.
But what's your guys' thoughts on that?
What you got on it? No, you want us to go first.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brennan. What you got?
Yeah, so I think it depends on maybe the example, right? So I think some people could be accused of poaching someone else's material, and I guess the way I think of poaching is generally in a fairly negative sense. Like poaching is a fairly negative word, where I'm just taking someone else's material, I'm teaching it like it's my own, right? However, there's very, very few new things with shooting. Pretty much everything has already been said or has been been getting practiced or performed somewhere else. So I think what instructors need to focus on is getting as much information as they can, breaking it down, digesting it for themselves, applying it. Like if you hear something new, I just like attack control, right? JJ Rakaza teaches that. Like I heard that first from Billy, and Billy credited JJ with it, right? And like I learned stuff from Billy about that. And then I went and took JJ's class and I learned additional stuff about it that was unclear to me before, right? And I heard Billy probably talk about that like 4 or 5 times in classes, right? And I learned additional stuff. And I was incorporating some of that training into my own training. I was like, this has a certain amount of value for different things. I trained with JJ. It changed my mind on some things, and I started incorporating it differently. And when I explain it, like I have some inherent bias, I guess, to how it was taught to me from several different people. So like I will sometimes like there will be some stuff that like probably Billy presented to me in a way that was very memorable. I remember that like kind of blew my mind, right? And then there's some stuff that like really refined some of that stuff and helped me change the way I think about it that was probably a little bit unhealthy, just from the way I had digested that information. And so when I talk about it, I will say, this terminology is, I believe JJ came up with it, right? There are lots of people teaching variations of this. Here's how I understand it. Here's how I understand it to be helpful, based off of how I've practiced it. But what I really have a problem with is people hearing something and the next day putting it into their training curriculum. Like to me, that's the height of laziness. Like, oh, that was cool. I really like that. And I'm just going to teach that verbatim, word for word in my class next week, right? It's like, man, have you explored that? Have you tried that? Have you figured out where that works and where it doesn't? Have you applied it in matches? Have you introduced this to a student like as an exercise or, as an experiment to see how it works for different people? Like, come on, man. So I think you have to put in the work and then give credit where credit is due. If you have a good understanding of it, it'll be natural. And if you don't, it's going to look like poaching in the worst form of the word.
Yeah. I'll throw a couple things in there. I think if we're saying that someone is poaching, that infers the person they're poaching from invented that thing. Now, when it comes to technique, there are people out there right now teaching stuff that they invented. For the most part, as far as I'm aware, across the board without exception, if there's anyone right now today teaching shooting techniques they invented, it almost certainly sucks. So there's that, right? If someone's out there teaching trigger prep or teaching pulling the trigger aggressively without moving the gun or teaching how to grip the pistol or whatever it is, like, guess what? Like, people have been doing that at a very high level for a very long time. And none of us can really claim, if anyone's teaching that, like, we poached it from somebody in some way, shape, or form, right? But I think what you said, Brennan, is super key, which is that, like, I mean, I've literally had that done to me, right? In the sense that, like, someone will show up to my class and will hear something that is like earth shattering to them. Like they've never heard of confirmation levels for the first time. Keep in mind, I did not invent confirmation levels, right? And I'll literally see them teaching that in a class the next week. The problem that I have with that is not that they poach the material from me. It is that they do not understand how that works yet. Like, regardless of how well I taught it in my class, you do not understand how that works and how to apply it across dynamic courses of fire, like on demand a week later. Like, you just don't. And so the issue that I have there is people teaching stuff they don't understand. The last thing I'll mention, which is that which I think is interesting. The biggest things that I poach on purpose is terminology. And I do that on purpose because I think it is very useful for shooters across the performance shooting community to have kind of a lexicon in common so that when I say confirmation levels, you know what I'm talking about.
Agreed.
Right?
Yep.
You know, if you is it fine for you to, you know, invent some new way of describing that same thing and teach it to your students in a way that's possibly just as effective? Yes. But when your students show up and are like, "Hey, how do you address a blue style target?" I'm like, "What are you talking about, bro? Like, I don't know what that means, right?" And I think it's actually it's makes life really difficult, and it causes a lot of confusion. Where I try to be careful with that is, so as an example, like when I teach movement, like I very intentionally try to use like the terminology that JJ uses when he teaches movement, because as far as I'm aware, he has the most complete system for describing a lot of the things we do in movement, and it's the most commonly understood across competition performance shooting. So I don't really tend to like, I don't want to invent my own terms for that. Even in certain cases where frankly, I don't like, you know, English isn't necessarily his first language. I'm not sure some of those terms necessarily describe the thing super well, but people know what you mean when you say it. Right. And so that's what I'm going to try to use. And I think that's not only okay, I think that's what more people should do. And I wish we would do it more. And so that's where I get frustrated. Now, with that said, it also, there's room for confusion there because like I did a video yesterday on a drill that's very commonly known as trigger control at speed. I try to almost like use a different name for that because like obviously I think Ben is the one who made trigger control at speed very popular, and I know for a fact that he would probably disagree with some of the things that I do in that drill and some of the things I use that drill for, right? Like we have like some different perspectives and some of that stuff. So if I'm going to say, hey, this is Ben's drill and here's how we do it, and then I say stuff he disagrees with, like that's kind of unfair as well. So like I give him credit when I obviously explain that drill because people are obviously going to recognize it, know where it came from. But I'm like, also, here's what I'm using this for in my class, and like here's some thoughts on it, right? So anyway, that's just kind of where I come from on it.
Yep. So here's my take. As instructors, we, you know, travel across the country, whatever. Maybe you stay in your own state, whatever. Our
Yeah.
job is to essentially preach the things that we believe to be true with shooting. And I
Yeah.
think that if you just want to keep that like, hey, I'm the only one allowed to say this, I think
Yeah.
that your heart is probably in the wrong place.
Yeah.
I think also as instructors, it's super important that like if you hear something from someone else, like the number one thing that you need to go do is explore that before you actually like start talking about it, right? I think if you don't do that, like if you don't explore it and don't have a full understanding of it, I think that, you know, it becomes watered down and the message that originally was supposed to be, you know, deciphered becomes very, very different from actually what it should be. So like exploring it, fully understanding what it's about so you can explain it maybe several different ways. Like that's super, super important. But like if
Yeah.
I hear someone say like same terminology as me, like dude, I'm totally cool with it because to me that's like that's awesome. Like if I said it, obviously I believe it. And so like if I think that's good shooting and someone else is saying it, then that's just getting the message across even more and it's
Mm-hmm.
helping more people. So I don't know. I don't know. I think over the years, like you've seen people say like, "Oh, that's my thing," and it's
Yeah.
like it's not really your thing. Like I don't think any of us have ever, you know, like everything that we do, like someone else has probably done or said at some point in shooting.
Yeah.
So I think the difference is though, like as shooting nerds, we explore it a lot and fully understand it before we actually talk about it in a class.
Yep. Yeah, it's huge, man. And like when you hear somebody like truly doing like a word for word copy and paste, that's usually a really good indication they haven't explored it, right? Because they just
Right.
don't like. I feel like from one shooter to another, like even if we agree for the most part in principle on how something works, like if we both take that and explore it for a year, we're going to come across almost certainly with a slightly different explanation of it because we're going to apply those principles slightly differently.
Yep.
And again, we're going to have a different, in some cases, Brennan mentions like the attack control thing, right? Like um I think when I use that drill, a lot of times I'm if I use a drill like that, maybe I'm trying to use that same drill someone else uses, but I'm using it to deliver a completely different principle,
Sure.
in class. Like I'm like, hey, because I'm sitting there doing it in curriculum development, like, hey, what's a good exercise to get across this point? Or I could use this drill over here that was used for a completely different thing to prove a whole different point that I'm trying to deliver in class, right? And so
Yep.
it's never going to be an exact, copy paste, I think, for the most part. Not in the effort to avoid that, but just because like we're all different shooters that apply things differently.
I think along these lines, right, as soon as like you hear something as a shooting nerd, quote unquote, like you hear
Yep.
something sense, like I've done this several times. I hear something and I'm like, that's amazing. Like I'm gonna go
Yeah.
do that. And then if I do it and I'm like, yep, that's the way I do it, I completely throw out other things and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not emotional about it at all. I was like, yep, that's the way. Like,
Yeah.
good example, like teaching today with Fabio. He's actually sitting right here. Fabio from My Own Defender. Um, like talking about some mounted movement stuff. Like I'm like listening to him and I'm like, yep, I'm probably changing some of that stuff. Like I
Mm.
like the way that he said that. Like, and totally unemotional about what I do. Like I'm going to change that most likely.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yep.
But so when you say, and a lot of times, like again, just the stuff that I will adopt immediately is a lot of times like maybe a different explanation of something, like what you're saying, like the way you say something. You're like, yep,
Yep.
that's a concept that I've already explored for 5 years, but that's a way better way of saying it, right?
Yep.
Like that's cool. I'll adopt that immediately for sure. Brennan, last but not least, what'd you have, bro?
All right. Yeah. So this might be a little bit spicy. It might hurt some people's feelings, but frankly, I don't really care at all. So,
Oh, goody.
some stuff I saw circulating, and to be fair, this was a couple of weeks ago, several weeks ago at this point, but it's been a minute since we recorded our last episode. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about. Um, Quite a few people kind of shitting all over the scoop draw, or what people know to be called the scoop draw, right? Um, Very interesting for me to watch those specific people talk about it, because their draw frankly sucks, and they can't even come close to the times that guys who can do these scoop draws or whatever you want to freaking call it can't really come close to those times. The biggest thing that I see, and this is fairly draw specific, but I think this can be applied to almost any technique, is generally when you see someone attacking a technique with a lot of emotion involved with it, it's usually because they cannot do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think out of all of us, maybe Billy and then me and then Nick, kind of in that order, started kind of drawing the way that we all do, and we all have our own little spin on it or whatever, right?
For
But
sure.
I have seen a lot of people go, well, this thing is stupid because I can't do it consistently. And so these guys who are out here, like,
No, they
they're
don't say
just
that. They
posting.
don't say that. They say this is stupid because you can't do it consistently.
Well,
That's what they
okay.
say.
That is correct. That is correct. What we know to be true is that they can't
Yes.
do it consistently.
Right.
Even if they say that they can, but they're choosing not to, because if they did, they would just do it anyways, because a faster draw is a faster draw, right? So yeah, the thing that we take away from that is generally, well, you must not be able to do it very well, and that's why you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. So yeah, I think I have just kind of an issue, and I guess I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, especially surrounding the draw, because it is kind of the low hanging fruit here. what you guys kind of think about that, how we should be responding to that, if it's a conversation worth having with people, if it's just like, you know what, you're gonna be dumb about what you want to be dumb about, that's fine as well. I also think that like fine, like you don't have to draw like me. I don't think that you need to. You definitely don't need that in a match. Certainly not. But yeah, I think if you can
So
do something consistently to a high level, why wouldn't you?
I got a super fascinating comment here recently. This is actually like the second guy I've ever blocked on Instagram because he ended up being just a very super toxic. But here's an interesting excerpt from it that'll highlight exactly what you're talking about, Brennan, in terms of the emotional response. It doesn't matter what finger indexes first, what angle your wrist is at, or the direction your hand is moving when you're not hitting all A's anyways. The difference between a bad run or a perfect one will not be because a scoop. Let's keep the P in USPSA.
That's retarded.
First of all, shooting all A's in a match is not the goal. First of all. But second of all, I to respond back with the question, Brennan, like I'm super curious. You just trained with probably like maybe the best pistol shooter to ever live. Did you all work on the draw again in the class you were in? I know the other class did for sure. Did you work in it in yours? You didn't. So the other one did. The other one did the exact same thing that we did last year, which was super interesting for me to see. We trained with Eric for 2 days. He didn't mention grip once. He did make us work on having a really, really fast draw though. And he was trying to force the open guys to have a 0.6 draw out of the holster with consistency, which they were protesting about quite a bit. And me and Brennan just were having a good time. But anyway, his point that he made was like, dude, if we're shooting world shoot and we're shooting 30 stages and I'm 0.2 of a second faster than you on every single stage for free on the draw without having to shoot any more aggressively, that stacks up to actually like quite a decent chunk of time. And so, that was his take. So I'll let anybody that wants to, kind of argue that point with him, feel free. Yeah, I'm super, super over the debate in terms of semantics. What is and what is not a scoop. My kind of history on this has been that I thought scoop was a really poor description of it to begin with. And so I tried to call it something else. And then everyone just insisted that what I was doing was a scoop. So I gave up and started calling it a scoop. And then everyone got mad at me for calling what I do a scoop. And so here we are. I don't really care.
Somewhere in between.
I do not give a crap what you call it. I just care that it works, right?
To be perfectly honest, I did a YouTube video on the draw and I was trying to figure out what to call it so it would get views. And in my I think in my thumbnail or something, I was like, how to do a scoop draw or something, and it did fantastic. And yeah, it did much better in the algorithm than like, here's how I do a hybrid scoop pluck snatch pause draw.
I literally ended up changing mine. I forget what it was called to begin with. It was called, I think it said scoop pluck or snatch hybrid in maybe the description at once, and it like no one ever saw it, right? And I simply changed the title to say scoop draw, and now it's like every month one of my highest performing videos. And it is what it is. Again, even if it's not the best term, like people understand what you mean, which is kind of the main idea, right? But look, people will argue about it. I say people all the time. I don't really care how you draw, man. If improving your draw by 0.3 is like not on your list of priorities, cool. Like, am I going to sit here and talk down to JJ or Ben Steger or Christian Seiler because they're all slower than the draw on me? No. Like, they're way better shooters than me across the board. Like, cool. Like, I will admit that in a hurry. I can draw faster than all of them, and I like that, and that's something I worked very hard for. But I don't look down on those guys because they don't care to make that improvement. Like, in no way, shape, or form, right? However,
and those aren't the guys we're talking about either, for what it's worth.
100%. 100%.
Those guys are never going to put a video out on why they don't like the scoop draw.
No,
correct.
It's literally a video talking about why the scoop draw sucks is not that interesting.
Right.
It just is like, man, like it just tells me like, hey, you've never tried it. Because in all those videos, people are like, oh, you can't be consistent. It's like, no, You can't be consistent because you've never put
Yeah.
time in. And if you don't want to do it, that's fine. If you want to
Right.
give me 0.2 or 0.3, whatever I'm stealing from you, then
Yeah.
I'm happy to take it. Fine.
Yeah.
That's my
But
take.
And
what I am done doing though is making excuses for folks on like why that it doesn't matter. I'll give you a super interesting discussion I had with somebody this week, which is another instructor, and he was talking about another instructor, and he was like, "Hey man, like we do things differently." But he was bringing up like a certain standards drill, and he's like, but he's like, we can both meet like the expert level standard on that exercise. So like both of them meet the parameters. And I was like, well, hold on now. Like you're both meeting the parameters, but are you faster than him usually? And he's like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, I don't believe in parameters. There's no such thing. I'm a performance shooter, and that's how I judge technique and different ways of doing things is by the performance. Like, yes, I get it. We have to have standards, like for a team, or we have to have standards like to give out a patch in class or whatever. But does that arbitrary line actually mean anything in terms of how good you are as a shooter? No.
no.
Right? No. Like what if we both meet the standard, but your way is faster, well then I still want to be as fast as you are, like regardless whether we met that parameter, right?
Hmm.
Um something, to me, something Eric talks about obviously in the class a lot is, obviously we got to be fast, but man, it's really cool to be like super freaking fast everywhere but the shooting.
Yes.
So that you can take some of the pressure off of the pulling the trigger part and actually be a little bit more careful there and shoot a whole lot of points and be really fast everywhere else. And that includes the draw. That is again a place where you can just get free time back on the
Yep.
board without giving up anything in terms of consistency, points, whatever it is. You're just getting the gun out of the bucket really fast. And at this point, it is undeniable that there is a particular way to do that that is faster than anything else that's out there.
Hmm.
And so, it is what it is.
Yeah. I mean, so like, I will also say the other thing that is just not the whole argument is, the thing that you mentioned about it not being the most important thing in a match.
Yep,
And I think you had a good point. Like over a major, if your draw is consistently faster than everybody else by a lot, then that is pretty awesome, right? And
yep,
I think for a lot of times it can be quite a bit more than 2/10, which is your example. But
for sure.
if you were to talk to somebody like Max Michel, and I have not had this conversation with him, but he used to do a lot of steel challenge, a lot of the kind of the JJ and KC and all those guys, right? They did a bunch of steel challenge. Max has a bunch of world titles from that. And if you
Hmm.
talk to him about that, it's 5 shots. Like, you think the draw matters for him? Like 100% it does. And like, it's a wrist above shoulders draw. Like, granted, my wrist above shoulder draw kind of sucks, right? Like, I should work it more often. But if you asked him about like, how are you working to shave hundreds and tenths off of your draw, he would be like, well, here's what I worked on. Here's how I've been doing that, because that 100% matters depending on the context, and it can matter more or less. Does it matter as much on a 30 round field course? Of course not, right? On a 5 round
Yeah.
steel shoot, yeah, it's huge. So
Well, that's where too, I think that people people forget, like there are people out there that only train shooting to be good at USPSA. That's not any of us
yes,
here.
right.
Right? Now, do I train certain things specifically to do well at matches like these days? Yes, I do, because I love that stuff and I'm kind of into it now. Right? But like that's not my main motivation for being good at shooting. But people will literally start shooting USPSA and will allow the way that, you know, Jake Martin's build stages at nationals to to tell them what skills are important and what skills are not, right? So like
Yeah.
it was funny. I was talking with Isaac Lockwood at Diagnostics Nationals in 2023. I think there was one stage maybe where you could like draw directly to a pretty aggressive target. Like there was, I think one.
And
Like,
it was fixed time.
yeah, it was like every single stage, you either had to get somewhere to start shooting, or you were drawing, to like a 25-yard, half A zone partial or whatever. And so like, yeah, I think a lot of times in USPSA, like match designers almost intentionally try to make the draw not matter if their draw sucks, right? That doesn't mean that that's not an important skill to me for other applications of shooting, and just for mastery in general. So anyway, we've probably harped on that enough. I'll wrap up with a quick questions answered. I think you guys will appreciate this. Whenever I got this again today, whenever we do an AMA on Instagram, I'm sure one of the most common questions you get is like, "Hey man, when are you coming to do a class in wherever?" And we love that because we like that people love to see us. But I'll just give you a quick explanation since we're all officially doing this full time now. Here's how this works. If you go to any of our websites or any other instructor you want to train with, there's a schedule or a list of places where that guy is going. And if there's a place that's not on there, he's not currently scheduled to go there. That's kind
You've
of
already lost most people. I mean, this is really complicated.
But most of us will go pretty much anywhere. Pretty much anywhere, right? So all you got to do if you want an instructor to come to your town primarily is just arrange access to a range. If I call your local gun club and I say, "Hey man, I want to come put on a club there," they're going to tell me to we'll leave that alone. But they're not gonna let me just show up usually, right? Because I'm not a member. They have no idea who I am from Adam, so on and so forth. But if you are a member, you may be able to arrange access there. Or if there's some place that doesn't have all the gear, if you have some target stands and some barrels and stuff like that, you may be able to, kind of provide some of those resources. So, in exchange for just kind of arranging that access, you typically at least get a free slot to a class that you train for free. So, if you want to train with us or anyone else, hit up your instructor of choice and just ask them what's required to host a class. We usually try to make that process extremely easy. And we'll come anywhere and put on a class, and you'll get in there for free, and we'll have a good time. last piece of free info for the podcast today, guys. I think that's about it. We've gone on long enough. Hopefully that was some good information for folks. All of our information down below. If you want to train with any of us, again, all the websites and the infos down below. Check these guys out. Train with them, you get a chance. You will not regret it, I promise. And until next time, guys, this has been Speed Up and Get Your Hits. Thanks for watching and listening.